All right, so the Vietnam War, how does it end? It ends in the 70s, the 1970s, so we've made our way now some 30 years or so since World War II. The losses are fairly heavy. The people's will for it, as far as the public, is not high. People are tired of the war. That is, most Americans are, I think, not enthusiastic. I think certainly I could say that. Most Americans are not enthusiastic about the Vietnam War. Many people do not really know the purpose why we're fighting there. And of course, a lot of people have died there. A lot of people were wounded and so forth. So it became a big issue politically, as we mentioned last time, 1968, when Richard Milhous Nixon said that he would bring an honorable end to the war when he's elected. The re-election comes in 1972, and Nixon is re-elected again, or re-elected as president, and then the war is still going on. However, in the midst of that political atmosphere, Richard Nixon, let's say he's a guy who's interested in what other people are doing, right? He gets. Some might call him paranoid. I don't know if he's clinically paranoid, but he is rather suspicious at times. How's that? I guess we all are, right? But one of the things that he would do is he would record what was going on in the office. He had a recording system. So if somebody came in for a meeting in the Oval Office, it was being recorded. I don't know if they always knew it was being recorded, but it was. So there were a series of tapes that he had, they were called, because it was being recorded on I think a reel-to-reel recorder for the day. That will sort of end up being his... Ironically, I think what he was recording to sort of protect himself became part of the thing that got him into trouble. But what happens during the 1972 election, he is running then against McGovern, a guy named George McGovern, who's a Democrat from Minnesota. And he's really, I don't think by all indications of what I've read, Nixon should have won. I mean, he did win easily in 72. And probably would have won, but he was concerned that he might not win. And so, in fact, what happened was some people, and there's still some question as to whether I don't think he directly ordered this to happen, but he found out about it later. Which is, often, by the way, if you want to learn a lesson from the politicians, the thing that often gets politicians into trouble with a scandal or whatever is not necessarily the scandal itself, but it's trying to hide the scandal. The cover-up is what gets them in trouble. Okay? Anyway, often. So what happened is that some people entered the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C., that was housed in a large building that had apartments but also office buildings, and it was called the Watergate Building. And so they entered the Watergate Building into the offices of the Democratic National Committee, and basically started going through files, trying to see what they could potentially find out what they knew, that is, the Democrats knew, or what their strategy might be, so on. They were looking for information there. In the process, they were caught inside there. And those guys, who were pretty low level, were arrested. Then eventually it came out that some people higher up had ordered them to do this, people that had worked in the White House, and Then the question came, as I remember they used to repeat it often, what did the president know and when did he know it? Okay, so I don't think anyone ever said he actually ordered it, but he did find out about it. He may have generally said we need to find out information. The procedure, I don't know how much he knew. Anyway, this is what got him into trouble. So this is called the Watergate scandal. So it's just sometimes just called Watergate, which is actually the building, at least a few years ago, was still standing. It's still there. Watergate building's still there. And so then this is also led in at least American slang, culture, that gate now means a scandal. So if you have, I don't know, Iran Gate or Iraq Gate or whatever else gate, they take Watergate and they take the gate part off of it and put it on another word, and it's supposed to mean a scandal, political scandal or something, right? For example, when Bill Clinton was president, there was Travelgate, some people called it, where they had the travel office in the White House that had corruption in it, so on. Okay, so it gets used in a more general way that way, but that's where it comes from. Well, when Nixon is reelected, then this is going to affect the war. The Watergate scandal will affect the war. And you need to understand that to figure out why some of this stuff happens at the end of the war, because during this process, Nixon is being investigated, certainly by 73. He resigns in 74, I believe summer of 74, August. I don't remember, August the 8th, August the 6th. Anyway, somewhere in there he resigns. He actually steps down. His vice president then becomes president, right? Which is what happens when a president dies or resigns. The vice president becomes the president. So he had also had troubles with his vice president prior to this, so he had a new vice president. He had a vice president named Spiro Agnew, who got into some trouble with finances. But anyway, his vice president is Gerald R. Ford. Gerald R. Ford had been a longtime congressman from Michigan. He was a quarterback, played quarterback for the University of Michigan football team, and had been in Congress for a long time. He was well respected, well known. He'd been around Washington for a long time. He becomes president then. And one of the things that he decides to do is to pardon Richard Nixon. This was controversial because, some people wanted to impeach Nixon as president, but then he resigned. So how much use impeaching him once he's resigned? Then some people wanted to maybe do some criminal prosecution, drag this thing on and on. So finally Gerald Ford said, look, I'm going to give him a presidential pardon. Let's put this behind us. So that might well be part of the reason why some people did not vote for him in 1976. Yeah. The Richard Nixon pardon certainly was a factor. And I think a lot of people wanted to clear out everybody out of Washington and start over. And so they elected an outsider, who's kind of an outsider, whose name was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter in 76. Also, there was trouble with the economy at that time in the 70s. Inflation, there was a lot of inflation of products, the prices. So, it wasn't just Watergate, but that certainly hung heavy over that election of 76. Carter was a one-term president. So Gerald R. Ford, I guess, has the distinction of being, I'd have to look it up, but I think he was the only person who served as president, right, who was never elected as president. I have to go back and look at that, but I think he's the only one. Because if you think of like Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy is assassinated, then Lyndon Johnson is elected. He's elected in the next term. But Gerald R. Ford became president, but then was never then elected president. Anyway, certainly in modern times, he's the only one, and I think probably for the whole presidency. So Jimmy Carter comes into power then. Well, Vietnam ends then. Remember the elections in 72 and the other elections in 76. So by the time we get to the presidential election of 1976, Vietnam is over, but is not ended in a way that most Americans are pleased with. Why? The idea is that America is and has been and is winners. We're winners. We like to win. We like to be successful. And certainly in wars we had been successful. We also, want to think that when we're fighting a war, it's for a good reason. So the Vietnam War presented a lot of challenges to that. People understanding what it was about, people agreeing with it, the fact that it's televised, the fact there were so many protests about it, became such a political thing. And this, of course, has affected things since. So this was, I think, a major turning point. And then when the war ends, yes, we get out of the war, you might say honorably. There was a peace treaty signed, but most people still believe that we lost the war. Why? Because of what happened after that fact. The peace treaty is signed in January of 1973, which officially brings an end to the Vietnam War, and then negotiations are supposed to continue. But what didn't happen, like what did happen in Korea, is that we didn't leave any troops there. We didn't establish a firm sort of boundary. Part of that was made more difficult because in Korea you got an actual peninsula, so to move people and supplies and troops, if you don't do it on land, do it on the water, it's a lot easier to see it. Here, they're moving goods through other countries, neighboring countries. And then the whole thing collapses very shortly thereafterwards. But the United States did not have the will, the desire to really go in there and back up the South Vietnamese anymore. We were done with this. And Vietnam is now unified, but it is unified under communism, and still today it is. Okay, so that's the end of the war. And you end up with a unified Vietnam, North and South. Saigon, the capital in the South, has changed. Its name is changed to Ho Chi Minh City. So, I guess to make the point, how it ended, right? Well, let's talk a little bit more about Nixon. Richard Nixon, obviously controversial. One of the things we see happening across the globe, certainly in the West, since the time of World War II, and perhaps starting with the Great Depression in the 1930s, is we see increasing power to a central government. And then World War II reinforces that. And so we see with Richard Nixon, of course, someone who, the presidency of the United States has increasingly gained power, let's say over the past 50, certainly over the past 100 years, 50, 60, 70 years, since the time of the Depression, since the time of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The American presidency has ascended to more and more power. And that's certainly, I think, where it is today, where it's been for a while. Okay, and it's interesting to see what's happening because basically, it's kind of a breakdown of the system. It didn't just start with Trump. I mean, it's been around. For example, Obama used executive orders. I don't know how many executive orders he issued. Executive orders originally were intended to be kind of ceremonial things, just protocol sort of things. Somebody wants to declare this week national whatever week, or a day to honor a veteran or something. Then there would be an executive order that, hereby says that April the 21st is this day. And occasionally to deal with other sort of temporary procedural things. But the executive order has now become the way of legislation. Congress doesn't end up voting on things. The president just signs something and it happens. See, that's really not the system that was set up. So the system, the executive order system, is a way to bypass Congress and to implement major policies is certainly something that's really been happening over the past 10 to 15 years. I think it's a major, going to be increasingly a major role. So then what happens is the next president comes in, can simply revoke that executive order. So instead of things going through Congress, actually becoming a law, people debating it, voting on it, people going through a procedure, you just sign a document that says this, you implement it. Now, there are some restrictions, but it is somewhat autocratic, right? So we see a lot of that also with Richard Nixon. He's not using executive orders, but he is using the power of the presidency. Well, he had promised an honorable end to the Vietnam War, but what happened in 1975 didn't look that honorable to people. Of course, again, it was all televised. And there was an evacuation of our allies and our final remaining diplomats and troops out of Vietnam onto aircraft carriers and so forth nearby via helicopters. There's even scenes that are televised that of helicopters. There wasn't enough room on the ship for everything and all the people and all the equipment. So that when a helicopter came in, I still remember there wasn't enough room to keep it on the ship, so they just pushed it over into the sea before they took off, once they got the people off. So, this doesn't look like an honorable exit. I suppose technically you might say, yes, the war had ended previously, and now those talks after the war broke down. But that's pretty technical. It's not what it looks like. So, this was something that he did have to deal with. Of course, he's no longer president when that happens. But everything's been set into motion. I think another thing, of course, that certainly Richard Nixon brings about or implements in his foreign policy is using shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. His Secretary of State is Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger, since, for example, Israel wouldn't talk with the Palestinians or Israel wouldn't talk with the Jordanians, so Kissinger would go talk to the king of Jordan and then get on a plane and fly to Israel and talk to the prime minister of Israel and go back and forth. This comes to be called shuttle diplomacy, where the United States becomes the sort of go-between, negotiator, especially Henry Kissinger, for peace in the Middle East and for other events, foreign policy. But certainly Nixon will personally visit China in 1972 and brings about, since China was having some tensions with the Soviet Union, this was, I think a pretty shrewd move on his part. It was certainly unexpected. And generally at the time, I think, thought to be, many people thought Richard Nixon would never return from China. These people would arrest him, imprison him, kill him, something. You know, they didn't think this was a wise idea. And it's televised. So for the first time, you know, China had been very isolated. So for the first time now, television cameras follow the president, broadcast all over the United States, I'm sure all over the world, to get a real view of what communist China was like. Now some 30 years or so after it begins. Well, not even 30 years, right? 1949, so about less than 25 years. And it then opens up dialogue between the United States and China for trade and lots of other. And this also kind of we wedge ourselves in between the Soviet Union and China. We give the Chinese another option for selling their goods and doing their economy. And we see that has just grown, right, over the past, 82, 92, 2002, 40, 45 years. China's economy has boomed. The United States economy has benefited from that in many ways. Now it's getting so large that, you know, some people say it's hurting our economy. And in part, that's what leads to this peace conference. The Chinese have a lot of influence over North Vietnam. And so what Nixon is doing is setting up better relationship with China. He is sort of driving a wedge against our other superpower enemy, the Soviet Union. And at the same time, he's going to use this new relationship with China to bring an end to the Vietnam War. So because of this, I think pretty much directly because of this, we see a year later that there is a peace treaty between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which does officially bring an end to the war, but of course that peace treaty doesn't hold. So Vietnam, then we see the removal of all troops. North Vietnam agrees to a political settlement with South Vietnam, but when that breaks down, the communists resume their fighting in 1975, and then we pull out. We've already pulled out our troops, and we pull out our diplomats, and we take also some of our close allies, you know, people who had been translators for us, advisors, people that if they stayed would undoubtedly be imprisoned or killed. And by 1976, as we've already said, the communists have taken over the whole country. So this brings a lesson to the United States, I guess, a kind of a new way of thinking. You know, we'd had such a massive victory in World War II, where we really felt like we got into the war, we had a real purpose for the war, we had victory in the war. Hitler was defeated, Japan was defeated, and the war was over. Korea was, well, at least a stalemate, right? And that stalemate is held now up until today. But Vietnam, not really a stalemate. It looked like it was going to be a stalemate, kind of like a Korea. But then the communists overrun it. The U.S. doesn't keep them out. So this brings about a lot of changes. Changes relationships with China. And when that happens, we also begin to back away from Taiwan. So, you know, our relationship with Taiwan cools and our relationship with communist China warms up. And the Chinese say that, well, we want to reunify with Taiwan, but we pledge to do it peacefully. Well, that was, 76 or so, 75? That's been a long time now, all right? Over 40 years. It's still not unified. There's still some discussions there. That is potentially something that could happen in the future. I imagine some attempt will be made in the future. And we see a changing of leadership in the Soviet Union. Stalin dies, and we have the coming of Khrushchev. Khrushchev is a larger-than-life kind of person, someone who is, well, he famously went to the United Nations and in order to get attention and make his point, he took his shoe off and pounded on the table to use it like a gavel to make his point, and so he's sort of seen by people in the United States as somebody who's unpredictable. I think that would be a word. Volatile. Don't know what Khrushchev's going to do. And of course, in here that we haven't, we mentioned it in passing, but is the buildup of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union has them. They are short range, as we have them, and we have them placed, say, in Germany and other places in Europe. So the Soviets decide they will place them in Cuba, which is now, some 90 miles from here, 100 miles from here. And they certainly could go far enough to hit, say, Washington, D.C., other major cities in the southeastern part of the United States. And this ends up with the Cuban Missile Crisis then, which is Khrushchev that JFK is dealing with. But spoiler alert, the Soviets backed down. They had set up the bases and so forth. They were actually bringing the missiles on ships. And the United States sends ships out and blocks the ships. And it wasn't sure what was going to happen. That was in October. It could have led to a war. The Cold War could have become a hot war. But the Soviets backed down. They turned their ships around. So, if you want to know why, Cuba is such a flashpoint, it's that for many reasons. But that is the one that would stick in many people's mind, the Cuban Missile Crisis that takes place. That's Khrushchev. Now, he will stay in power for a while, but he will be replaced in 1964 by this guy, Leonid Brezhnev. What's that? Medals?
No, the little, I forgot what they're called. The pin things, I guess.
Pins, yeah. Well, let's just call them medals. Yeah, he's got a lot of them. Well, it's good to be the supreme ruler. You get one for everything. Because, by necessity, you are in charge, right? So you get a medal for everything. Yeah, the little pins. He's got a lot of pins. Meant to impress. Well, Leonid Brezhnev. In 1964, he replaces Khrushchev. He's more willing to appease the Chinese and to support North Vietnam. One of the things that he will do, because he's ruler of the Soviet Union for many years, and so we'll see that he'll be during the time of Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Ford, Carter. They sign a treaty called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ATM, or AMT. ATM is an automatic teller machine. AMT is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Just seeing if you're awake. I can see you're not. This is sometimes also called, AKA, also known as, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So this is called SALT, and it's usually called SALT 1. That makes you then it's your clue that there's going to be another SALT treaty. There is a SALT II. This happens in 1972. Well, what's the idea here? One of the things that has happened, that has developed in the late 1960s, early 1970s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly, is that the United States and also the Soviet Union have developed missiles that can travel intercontinentally. That is, they're intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs they're called. Intercontinental, what that means is we could launch one from the North American continent and we could hit Russia. You launch this stuff from Nebraska, let's say, Kansas, out in the middle of the United States. You have missile silos buried under the ground, secret, not really visible. A lot of people don't know where they are, maybe some local people, but if you're just flying over, you wouldn't see it. Then this big thing pulls back, missiles shoot out of there, go up into the stratosphere, go up high outside the atmosphere, and then head towards, let's say, the Soviet Union. So that would just be carrying one missile. But then what they decide, what they figure out, is that we could use one missile to launch many missiles at once. 6, 8, 10, 12 at once. And then while that thing is up above the atmosphere, those missile heads, warheads, would come out of that one missile. Each would be individually armed, and they get to the point where each is individually targeted. So you could launch something that, say, has 8 or 10 missiles in it, 8 or 10 warheads in it, and then once it gets up there, they are released. It opens up, and then they can fly on their own and then target 8 or 10 different places if you want. So you're not just hitting one spot in Moscow. You could hit 8 or 10 spots in Moscow, or you could even hit 8 or 10 different cities with one missile. Well, once we get to the point where we have so many of those, the United States has them, the Soviet Union has them. This treaty of 1972 basically says, let's limit our numbers. In fact, it is calculated that the Soviet Union and the United States each has enough missiles to wipe out the other many times over. Like 20 times over, let's say. So what does this treaty do? It says, you know what, maybe we should limit. Because what happens is as we develop a new weapon, we don't retire the old ones. Why? Let's keep it there. It works. It's not as high-tech, it's not as fancy as the old one, but you know what? Could get the job done, and it's a nice backup. So we just keep getting more and more of them, and they keep getting more and more of them. So this strategic arms limitation, then, is let's limit our weapons so we can only, say, kill each other 10 times over instead of 20 times over, something like that. Let's be reasonable. So let's look at some of these letters. The military loves their letters. So here's ICBM and MIRV. These are called ICBMs and sometimes called MIRV. So what does this stand for? I've already told you ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And we put a little S after it, means missiles. So here is a picture of one taking off from an underground silo. Each one of these missiles has multiple warheads which can be independently targeted. That's where MIRV comes in. Multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, or MIRV. You can tell the military made up these names, right? Because they love that kind of acrostic. So each ICBM would have, MIRVs would have multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles. They left the T out. the targeted part, so they could have MERV. MERV sounds good instead of MERTV. MERV, you know. Anyway, so you need to know some of this. Now, we had this. We were developing this in the late 60s, early 70s, and by 72, the Soviets have this technology. You know, they're usually a couple of years behind us, but not much. So that's what the SALT I treaty was about. Let's limit some of these. And so you have to understand, this is the culture that we're living. This is what's happened sort of with the Cold War and nuclear weapons and these missiles. People are living, really for the first time, let's say in the 1960s, with the concept that the entire world could end in like 20 minutes. Right? A half an hour. All right, an hour. In other words, let's say the Soviets launch these missiles. What's the United States going to do? We're going to launch our missiles. Our missiles will cross in the air somewhere, and they're going to come down. So maybe if the Soviets do it first, they might win because they will destroy us 10 minutes before we destroy them, right? So that's the idea. In schools, children are taught the power of nuclear weapons, and they are told that they should duck, run, duck, and cover. This is your protection. So say in this classroom, we would have a drill, and some alarm would go off. You'd throw your chair back, you'd get under the desk, crouch under the desk, put your arms over your head, and
Protect you from the radiation.
Yeah, right.
well, of course. They had a nice little cartoon with a turtle,
Oh, I think it was.
and the turtle will, like the turtle goes in his shell to protect himself, you have to sort of hide. So if you're walking along outside and you see the flash, well, there's a wall over here, just, get up next to the wall, cover yourself up. Or if you're in the countryside, you can get down a little ditch or something, get down in the ditch. If you're in a building, we had, you go to the basement of certain designated buildings were shelters, right? Civil defense, CD, civil defense missile shelter. They used to have those signs up. And so like in the basement of a bank or something, there would be some place down in there where maybe you could go. Well, right, depending on where you lived and so forth, your survival rate. There would be, I grew up near Chicago, and so, there was no survival for us because it was a big city, and there was a lot of industry, and those would all be targeted. So, and then they would put a map up and they'd draw circles around it. Here in this area, everything will be flattened and just vaporized. And then in this area, you'll have the wind, this terrible flash of heat. And then in this area will be the radiation fallout. So, anyway. But this is the way people were trained. Children were trained. Now, what this leads to is what comes to be called MAD, another acrostic, MAD. What does MAD stand for? MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Mutually Assured Destruction, or MAD. Just like what I said. If, for example, we launch our missiles or the Soviets launch their missiles, as soon as that's detected, which will probably be in about 10 or 15, 20 minutes later, then the other side will launch their missiles, and then all these missiles will be up, descending within an hour, and we have mutually assured destruction. The Soviets, yes, they'll destroy us maybe 20 minutes earlier, but then our missiles are already in the air before they get destroyed. There's no chance that the Soviets can launch a missile strike, take out all of our missiles, and not have them launched on them, and same for us. Okay, so that was just what it was called. The U.S. and the USSR had anti-ballistic missiles. They begin to develop in an attempt to try to hit and destroy missiles in the air. So this is sort of the equivalent of a guy shoots a gun at you and you shoot a gun at his bullet. You know, you try to hit the projectile coming at you with another projectile. So that's pretty tough. But, you know, we have some things like that. We do have some missile defense systems now, have different names that are being used. Israel uses them, the United States system. The United States has a system. But the idea was that wasn't enough. Even that wasn't enough. So a nuclear attack, so basically I like their terminology. Basically they wanted to have a system whereby using a nuclear weapon by either side would be quote unquote unprofitable. I like that. Yeah, very unprofitable. So in other words, it was supposed to be a deterrent. We've got hundreds of weapons, but we're never going to launch them because if we launch them, we know they'll launch theirs. And they know that vice versa. If they launch theirs, we'll launch ours. So therefore, these weapons are there. As a deterrent, we want to make sure that we're strong enough that we can wipe them out if they try to wipe us out. So therefore, we won't use them. Because of MAD. Mutually assured destruction would make the use of the weapons unprofitable. In other words, the Soviets could not gain an advantage by launching 20 minutes early and somehow think they're not going to get a retaliation. Okay, so that's SALT. That's what leads to SALT. There you see Gerald R. Ford on the left and Leonid Brezhnev on the right. The idea here was to limit the amount of missiles being produced. The Helsinki Agreement of 1975 will also come during this period, which recognizes the borders of the U.S. Well, it recognizes the borders in Europe after World War II. Signed by European nations, the U.S. and Canada. So we start to see by the time we get to this point in the mid-70s that things begin to cool off a little bit officially because we know we can each destroy each other. So in some ways the threat is very high, but in other ways there is a deterrence. And what we start to see is often described by a French term called détente, a softening of relations. That is, you see Gerald Ford sitting down with Leonid Brezhnev and signing a treaty. That would not have happened 10 years before. You wouldn't see Kennedy sitting down with Khrushchev and signing some treaty. First of all, they would have never gotten to the table. Secondly, they would have never believed anybody would have followed the treaty. So why even bother? So we start to see things have changed over the past decade or so. And this is called the relaxation, the relaxing of the tension. It's often called détente, which is a French diplomatic kind of term, of improving relationships. When Nixon resigns in 1974 during the Watergate, then we see, as we've already mentioned, Gerald R. Ford becomes president in 74 and will remain president until the results of the 1976 election, when Jimmy Carter comes to power, becomes president in January of 77. So now Jimmy Carter, by the way, is the oldest living president since George Herbert Walker Bush died. He was just slightly older than Jimmy Carter. I don't know, a few months, I don't know exactly. So now Jimmy Carter is the oldest living president, a one-term president, as was George Herbert Walker Bush, one-term president. But he had been vice president under Ronald Reagan, so that's coming up. So Jimmy Carter, president in 1977, And this was, I think, an election where people wanted to get somebody who didn't really have connections with Washington. They didn't really trust Washington. And so somebody who had a lot of experience, like Gerald R. Ford, actually had a harder time in this election than you might think, because he was so connected to Washington. He had been Nixon's vice president, and he had issued the pardon to Nixon. At any rate, the war in Vietnam is over by the time Jimmy Carter's there. Watergate is over, at least the main issues of it, not the aftermath. And we do have improved relations with China. However, our relations with the Soviets begin to break down in the Carter administration, because the Soviets begin a policy of promoting communism in third world, what is sometimes called the third world countries, especially in places like Africa. The Soviets are sending in military advisors to Angola and other places like that. By the way, they're using Soviet-trained Cuban military experts, I guess we'd say. They bring them over to work with this as well. So, you know, the relationship between Cuba and USSR is pretty strong. But they also then begin to promote this in places like Somalia, Ethiopia, South Yemen. So Yemen is still a problem today. There's fighting in Yemen because one Yemen is more communist than the other. And then, of course, Angola, where Cuban troops are sent in to help communist rebels take over the country. So they don't just go as advisors, they actually join in the fight. So this is creating a lot of tension then between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Again, by heating it up, this time with more aggressive military acts sponsored, participated in by the Soviets. Then the Soviets sort of have what some people call the Soviet Vietnam. It's called Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union sends troops in to support a communist government, a Marxist government in Afghanistan, and to fight against rebels in Afghanistan who did not want this Marxist government in place. They wanted to get rid of it. They felt it was not legitimate, and they certainly didn't agree with it. You see, because Afghanistan's a Muslim country, and communism by its very basic nature is atheist. They don't believe in God. So this creates a basic conflict between Islam and communism. And of course, they are also, this Marxist government was seen as a puppet, was seen as a branch of Soviet control. So in 1979, fighting starts in earnest there, with the Soviets fighting in Afghanistan. Any of this sound familiar? We've been fighting in Afghanistan now since right after 9/11, right? So 17 years. You might take a look. It didn't go that well for the Soviets. It didn't go that well for the British before that. I don't think it's going all that well for us either. But at any rate, why? Why did the U.S. do this? The U.S. did not join in this battle. So it's interesting. We've kind of reverse positioned, right? Whereas the Soviets and the Chinese were just sort of greatly involved in North Korea and North Vietnam, while the U.S. committed troops. They did not commit that. And here in Afghanistan, we do not commit any troops. No U.S. troops go to Afghanistan during this period. We commit a lot of weaponry, and we do training. Some people found it hard to believe that the United States had as an ally as one time a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden, that we had actually helped train Osama bin Laden, and we had given him weapons and stuff. Well, why? Because he was there as a freedom fighter. He was there as the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviets. And this, I don't find it surprising, because remember our basic rule of history: my enemy's enemy is my friend. Osama bin Laden wants to fight Soviets? Okay, we'll help you out. We don't have to fight them. You do. But we can give you some weapons. We can train you, do some training. So the Mujahideen were actually trained, and they were given these small, very portable, lightweight, but very effective shoulder-launched missiles. Kind of looks like a bazooka. It's like a tube on your shoulder. You just simply aim it. You have a real simple aiming device. You fire it. It's a heat-seeking missile. It's shoulder-launched. And then it goes after the heat of the engine of the airplane, the jet, the helicopter, whatever it is. And pretty accurate, by the way. Well, many people feared the Soviets might, from Afghanistan, move into Iran, because Iran was in upheaval. And of course, Iran has a lot of oil. So this is part of the motivation for us to help out the Afghans. The Shah of Iran had been overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Radical Islamic groups are taking over Iran. And a policy is developed, which some people have called the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine basically states that the U.S. would use force, it should be used, not us, would use force if necessary to guard the Middle East oil supplies. Why? Because they were essential to the United States security. This starts to be a policy. We're going to do something we're going to go up against something that threatens our national security. Certainly oil would fall into that category. And if the Soviets controlled all the oil of Iran, well, that would not bode well for us, it was thought. Well, the Soviets were attempting to control Islamic fundamentalism thinking that was happening in Afghanistan. Why? One of the things that some people don't realize is that the Soviet Union was a lot larger than Russia. And the Soviet Union incorporates a lot of diverse territories, and in fact, a lot of that territory is Muslim. I mean, it's dominated by a Muslim population in these regions. Places like Chechnya and so forth. And all the different stands, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so forth. These are all Muslim countries that were under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. And what the Soviet Union was afraid of was, we might think, kind of like the United States said, we wanted to contain communism. I think the Soviets wanted to contain and limit Islamic fundamentalism, because they were afraid if it really caught root in Afghanistan, it would then go to the other stands, if we want to call them that, Uzbekistan and so forth, Chechnya and so forth, and this would create great problems for the Soviets. Well, and so they thought, if we can stop it here, so that's part of their motivation, it turns out. However, they also knew, I think the Soviets believed correctly, that the U.S. would be, here's a term we used to use, I don't know if you know this term, gun shy. You ever heard the term gun shy? No? Well, I used to have a pet dog many years ago that was, we found it and we brought it in, to help the dog. Well, this dog, I don't know if somebody had shot at it at some time or not, but any loud noise, this dog was immediately, completely frightened, shaking, go and hide under the middle of the bed or whatever, just to try to get away. So let's say lightning storm, thunder and lightning. This dog was in panic until it was over. That's gun shy. Maybe you've had somebody shoot at you and they missed. Next time you hear a loud noise, it affects you. Well, that's the idea. The U.S. was sort of that way after Vietnam. We did not want to send troops into Afghanistan because we had sent troops into Korea and Vietnam had not gone well, so we don't want to commit troops now. But we can commit weapons, right? money, training, and let the Soviets deal with them. Some people have called this the Vietnam Syndrome. So today, even today, any sort of military operation, you will hear somebody talk about an exit strategy. Well, yes, you want to take this action, but what is your exit strategy? That is, how are you going to get out of this mess, right? You know, I mean, what constitutes this being over or being a victory or somehow ending? So that relates back to it. All right. At the same time, then, with all this upheaval in Iran, there comes a crisis that affects the United States because the embassy of the United States is overrun by these radicals, I guess we'll call them, right? And they take them hostage. So this is called the Iran hostage crisis, which takes place in 1979, late 1978. There was a movie recently done. What was that movie called? About 3 or 4 years ago, there was a movie. Argo. Yeah, that's what it was called. That was about, I mean, sort of, it wasn't exactly some fictionalized, but gives you the idea that basically these diplomats and so forth are taken hostage. And they're held. They're held for over a year during the Carter administration, all during the election. And they have special news every night. They'd have the update. A new news program started. It was called Nightline, eventually called Nightline. I don't know if it's still on or not, but it was on ABC, and every night the guy would come on for a half an hour to an hour just talking about the developments of it, what's going on with it. Eventually Jimmy Carter tries to send in a rescue operation with some helicopters to fly in and try to, release them, fight their way out. The helicopters crash in the desert. None of this looks good. They say because of the dust, they were flying low and they were picking up sand or something. I don't know. That's what they said. So basically this is real reason why Jimmy Carter lost. I mean, there were a lot of reasons. There was financial problems, but this hostage crisis just would not go away. Been over a year, and they just put how many days since they've been held? 200 days, 300 days, so forth. Held them through Christmas, held them through the whole year. And Ronald Reagan's running for president. Ronald Reagan says he will end the crisis. Well, you know what? Just to sort of add insult to injury, on the day of the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, the hostages are released. They released them on, like he's being sworn in. Now he had said he would go get them, is what he said. So whether it was the threat of Ronald Reagan, I mean, you can debate that, but one thing you can't debate is that these guys have been held hostage for over a year, and on the day that Ronald Reagan is sworn in, they are released. So you get the news Ronald Reagan has become president, you get the news all these hostages are released. Well, Ronald Reagan will be a very different style president. He becomes president in 1980. He will be elected to 2 terms. Re-elected in 1984. His vice president is George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who just recently died, is his vice president for 8 years. He was running for president too, and Reagan picked him to be his vice president. Okay, so then after Reagan's second term, Bush is elected president. Okay, so that brings us up to 1992. In 1992, the economy still wasn't doing that great. We had the end of the Cold War comes during the Bush years, 1989. Most people would say that's when the Cold War ends. There's the first Gulf War that Bush leads against Saddam Hussein. But Bush is not reelected, and Bill Clinton is elected. in 92 and reelected in 96. And then George Bush's son, George W. Bush, is elected in 2000 and serves 2 terms to 2008. Then Barack Obama from 2008 until the most recent election, right? And now Trump is president. Major events that take place during the Bush administration, the second Bush, is, of course, 9/11. And the war on terror begins, which has really defined the last 18 to 20 years. I mean, it even sort of begins in the Clinton years. Well, Ronald Reagan, president in 1980, takes a very hard line against the Soviets. He calls them an evil empire. He begins to develop new weapons. New weapons are being developed that are going to change things. One of them is a cruise missile. The cruise missile is basically a missile that we don't need like a giant intercontinental ballistic missile. What this missile could do, it could be launched from a submarine. It could be launched from a mobile kind of thing. But once launched, you might call it a smart missile, right? It has cameras, it has GPS, it has tracking. And you can actually, once it's launched, you can guide it. You get on it looks like a television. You get a screen, you control where it flies. You can fly it low, you can fly it up, you can fly it into a particular building. Pictures of this during the Gulf War where they're flying it down a chimney into a building or through a window. Pretty amazing, and it's all, you can see it all happening, right? This changes things. The cruise missile then is a kind of smart missile, but it also has the capability of sending a nuclear weapon that would be of a smaller size, sometimes called a tactical nuclear weapon. But the other thing that Ronald Reagan does, which I think is significant, some people don't think it's as significant, but he begins to fund a policy which is called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which basically is a system whereby we would launch into beyond the atmosphere lasers and other weapons that could knock out Soviet missiles that would be coming in up in space before they ever re-enter the atmosphere. Now, this was never fully implemented, never fully finished, although elements of it have. But the threat of it really wore on the Soviets, who already had the war in Afghanistan. Their economy was bad. They had to try to match that. They just couldn't do it. This is in part economically what led to the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the end of the Cold War. The media, didn't think this thing would work. They were skeptical of it. They labeled it Star Wars. So sometimes it's called Star Wars because it would be using lasers and stuff up in space. I guess we'll have to end it there. Terror, of course, is still with us, unfortunately, and will stay. Don't forget, Sunday night is our test. It is a unit test over the last 5 chapters. Everything has to be in by Sunday night. Okay? All right. We'll see you later.
You gonna come back too?